So the research examined, I was looking at cultural relevant elements, right? Cultural relevant elements for K-12 education in Kisii. And the purpose was with the research examined relationship between the key elements or elements of culture, of culturally relevant education that might support learning and teaching for primary and secondary school students in the Kisii tribe. And I've been asked before, why Kisii? Kisii simply because I was brainstorming and I talked to Mary. Mary pointed out a divergence in mathematics. So I started looking a little bit more. I got interested. So I started looking a little bit more, and the research completely took me to Kenya. So thank you, Mary. The research follows a post-colonial theory. It is a lens for understanding the relationship between the past colonial and current events. And it's also grounded in postmodern worldviews, which support contextualizing this research in the current period and lives of the natives or indigenous indigenous people. So I present the problem as learning in Kisii may be negatively affected by curriculums and pedagogies that are not culturally relevant. And this argument, as based in a post-colonial theory, is because education systems in most colonized countries are Eurocentric in nature. And there is a big divergence in language and sometimes mathematics, which is what I was looking at. And children, from neuroscience point of view, children start school, I believe children start school with minds that are already developed or pathways that are already developed. But when they go into the primary school, they have to start learning new things. It feels like they're starting all over. They're not continuing the learning from that they get at home from age 1 through 5. When they get into class 1, which is 5 years old, or standard 1, which is 5 years old, they start to learn new things, new system. They're not speaking the tribal language. We could argue that it doesn't always hold because of most nations to speak more than one language now, and English being one of them. But generally, it's a concept that still holds. So it basically argues that there is a mismatch between how Kisii children learn and what they learn in school and at home. So when you look at what they're learning in school, what they're learning at school, there is a difference and there is a mismatch. I use a qualitative research approach, focus ethnography. My tool was focus groups, interviews, semi-structured interview, and the analysis was done using a thematic network analysis and epistemic network analysis. That was fun, as you will see later. So the first question, this question was, what are the elements of culture that might support learning and teaching for primary and secondary schools in the Kisii tribe of Kenya? I asked this question across all the participants. So yes, I asked that question about culture across all participants. That way I have a solid basis for supporting the cultural argument. And what I found was interesting. So I found generally that there are 9 cultural elements that came up in the conversations, in the interviews regarding the culture of the Kisii people. And I'll just list them, and then maybe we can dig deeper on any of them that you don't understand. So rite of passage was one. Reward and punishment was another. Kisii education system. Basically, that the Kisii education system, I call it that, but it's basically informal education, or the whatever they learn at home. And learning at home is more hands-on and indicates that they prefer learning over a lot of theory in classroom. The students talked a lot about being bored and falling asleep in class and just not finding relevance in some of the things that were being taught in class. So the children going back to rewards and punishment, they don't like punishment, they don't like being punished. They think teachers take out their anger from home on the kids. Going backwards one more, rite of passage. Rite of passage is a big part of the culture that came up so many times. And I feel like rite of passage was the biggest surprise for me in the whole research, because it included things like circumcision, and how passionate the people talked about circumcision, and how their identity was so tied into the process of circumcision, not necessarily the act of the cutting of the body, or that simple practice, but the process that the child goes through during circumcision. So I found that to be one of the biggest things, because in most tribes, circumcision is frowned upon greatly. And even having grown in Africa, I didn't know the importance of circumcision until I visited the tribe, how education of the tribe was based on that, what their belief systems were, and how that was a way for the child to move from one stage of life to the other. So rites of passage was such a big topic, and they have 4 rites of passage: death, birth, marriage, and there's one more. Death, birth, marriage. There's one more. I'll think about it as we go. So the next one is counting and mathematics. I call it locus stem. And why I'm fascinated with locus stem is that there's so many things that are being done by children in Africa that they don't, in Kenya, in Kisii, or in some indigenous tribes that they don't necessarily conceptualize it as mathematical. They just take it as, oh, this is what we do every day, like the catapult. But it is real mathematical, or physics can be used, or engineering can be used to explain some of the things that they do. And I found that to be really fascinating. But like the catapult is a centripetal force, is what is used in physics to explain the use of a catapult. And you can see in the next picture how this young man builds his own tractor to move things from one place to the other. One other thing that I found really fascinating was the calculating in math, just the mindset or the way that children perceive things. Some children perceive things. In the classroom, when you say 2 divided by 2 is equals to 1, but in the child's at home, when you say 2 divided by 2, the child thinks if you've taken 2 things and you divided those 2 things, then you don't have anything left. So these little divergences or divergence that you find in mathematics, or even language, even history, these are little things that are really important for a child or for educators to understand when it comes to teaching a child. Like the local context, how does the child think in that local context? That diversity in thinking is very important. So I also found values, beliefs, language, Kenya having Swahili, English, and then Kisii, which is the tribal language. All these are part of the classroom. All the languages are part of the classroom in some places, but not in all places, not in all classrooms. So, but the children seem to really like when the teacher goes between these 3 languages. Beliefs goes back to rite of passage. You could tie back beliefs to rite of passage with what do they believe about life after death? What do they believe about marriage, adulthood, and all of that? So their belief systems fall under that, and it ties back to rite of passage, like I said, because there's a lot of things tied to when a child is born, what happens? Oh, is the child a twin is a child has an issue or not. So there's different things that are tied to birth as a whole and marriage, different belief system tied to marriage too. Like if you cheat on your wife, what happens? Do you die when somebody is sick and comes sees you, you die? That's one of the things that they said, which was quite interesting, how they build in morals into their belief systems. Values, as regarding values, I found that they were talking about courage a lot. The young boys, when we asked them the questions, they talked about courage, and you can even see their body language move as they talk about courage. One value that I found, something that when you look at cultural literature, is clothing. Clothing is usually considered a sophist culture, but when I looked at the culture of the Kisii people, I noticed that clothing seemed to be a value system, which is a deep culture. Deep culture simply means that it affects, when change, drastically change, it affects the child's thinking, it affects the child's behavior and character. So dressing is one of those. There's a lot of talk about dressing. So for me, instead of putting it as a sophist culture, I put it under value system, and it goes under deep culture here. There's a lot of respect. There's talk about respect and how children are not respecting their elders anymore. So it's interesting to see how Kenya is shifting, even though the literature says Kenya is becoming more an individual, instead of communistic society, they are becoming more individualistic. They're higher up in the index range compared to other African countries. When it comes to heritage, they talked about food. Food was the #1 thing when we asked them what they were proud of. They would say food, and then they would talk about circumcision. So food, and they're very proud of their food, their fufu, which is ugali. There was a lot of talk about food, and food for me falls under heritage. I classify it under heritage. And there was a lot of talk about oral traditions, where the stories that the teachers tell in class to help them better understand. There was a lot of talk about that too. Any questions on that before I move to the next question? All right. Research question 2 looked at what are the culturally relevant practices, strategies, and processes that enhance learning for students, for Kisii students in primary and secondary schools. So this is going to read a little bit like recommendations, but bear with me. So I found 5 strategies that support, 5 cultural elements that support strategies, practices, and processes used in teaching. And language being one of them. Like I mentioned earlier, some teachers use the 3 different languages interchangeably, or code switching, like they would call it. So they integrate language as a strategy for better understanding for the children. They look at the local context and culture, and they integrate those as a learning strategy, like just bringing in things from the local context, like the food into the classroom, that being the biggest one. They prioritize practical over theory. The students really loved that in the new curriculum, they are going to be doing a lot more hands-on. So that is something that the children really enjoyed, and also that the system is adopting and doing. Parents and elders was another key item that they pushed forth so much. They kept insisting that it is necessary to integrate the elders into the education system. And if you're a student of culture, and especially African culture or indigenous culture in general, you know that they love to transfer knowledge is transferred from one generation to the other through their elders. So most of the participants suggested that it would be important to bring in elders into the education system, so that the wisdom that they have can be passed on continuously passed on. They could have something like a get together where they go in and talk to these elders, or the elders come to the classroom and talk to the children. So that I found that to be really fascinating. I spent time with, this is Zach's grandmother, and just listening to her, like it's so refreshing, and you learn something. Even you spend 5 minutes with her, like you learn something from your elders, and it was nice to get that reminder through the research that our elders are extremely valuable, and instead of just moving on into the future without them and thinking they are the past, we need to bring in our past, which is why I really like the post-colonial theory, because it always looks at the past, the present, and then the future. So the children wanted as a strategy or practice that to eliminate all kinds of forms of punishment, which I understand their children. They don't want any kind of punishment. Question 3 was, what are cultural relevant strategies, practices, and processes that facilitate teaching of Kisii students in primary and secondary school? So one was from the perspective of the teachers, and then this is from the perspective of perspective of students. And it's 6 elements here, students and the parents too, like the things crossed into each other, supporting each other, enhancing each other, and then helping me to tighten up the number of elements that I pull based on how sometimes they intercross. So language integration is something that is being done, integrating the local culture also by the teachers. The teachers are doing that. The students want it, the teachers are doing it. In some places, they want more of it, integrating the practical over theory, and we know from the CBC curriculum that the government really is looking into getting that going full swing. And teachers think that it is important, teachers and parents and everybody thinks that it is important to maintain a form of discipline with maybe not caning, but there need to be a form of discipline in the classrooms. But they seem to complain that parents are not allowing, or the government is not allowing them to do any form of, do any kind of discipline. There's a lot of talk, I'll punish you today, I'll punish you tomorrow, I'll punish you after tomorrow. And then you never punish the child, you just keep threatening the child, but you never discipline the child. So the teachers think that that is something that needs to be a part of their education system. And then the parents, again, they want parents because they believe that's the way to preserve their culture and move it to the next generation. And it also facilitates learning. And there is the desire for parental support of the CBC. Like some of the teachers really wanted to push that parents pay careful attention to the CBC and support it more than they are doing right now. I found that integration of all these elements into the education system, 98% of the participants were in favor of it. The one person that wasn't in favor of it, after a significant amount, not too much, some discussions was like, yeah, I changed my mind. But I thought it's important to still keep it that the person's first impression was not to have integration of culture into the education system, but everybody wanted the integration of culture into the education system. All right, question number 4 is the most exciting question and the most complex of the analysis that I did. It was my first time doing epistemic network analysis, and I just felt so strongly that I could have just stopped where I am and provided my conclusion and recommendations, but I felt strongly that if I'm doing something that is STEM related, I will have some form of mathematical interest, I needed to put in a little bit more effort into looking at at the scientific part of it, even though I might not be really great at it. So the question was, what are the relationship between the cultural relevant practices, strategies, and processes that support teaching and learning for Kisii students in the primary and secondary schools? So I use, as units of analysis, I use all the 9 elements that I have listed. I use all of that in the ENA software to build out what a visual of what the whole research looks like. For those of you that love math, that it appears that ENA also uses the Pearson and goodness of fit, which helps us understand statistical differences. So for the whole data set that I had, this is when you organize it mathematically or on ENA using ENA, this is what it looked like. And just by looking at it, I'm not even looking at the mathematics, you'll see that the opinions of parents and administrators were very close, but there was a little bit of a distance between the teachers and the cultural expert, the teachers and the administrator. The one that was absolutely fascinating to me was the distance in thinking between the teachers and the cultural expert. So statistically, the data is different at y-axis 0.85 and x-axis 0.78. These are moderate numbers. And at the administrators, this one right here, the administrator was not statistically significant at the alpha point level when looked at it from the x-axis, but there's a variance when we look at the data from the y-axis. So the students and the cultural expert, because of that big gap, I decided to focus on them and look at them a little bit more closely. And the goodness of it is 0.9 and y at 79.79. Sorry. So the students the student group was statistically significantly different at alpha equal to 0.5 level, but not statistically significantly different at alpha 0.5 level from at the y-axis. So basically, what this says to me is that there is a misalignment based on the x-axis. There's a misalignment in the opinions of teachers, on opinion of cultural experts and students. So this whole page, I'm going to skip it because it's just detailing how things are connected. If you notice, heritage is strongly connected in the former. I'm going to say a little bit, then I'll skip it. It's in the formal education system. I mentioned earlier in the analysis question 1 and 2 and 3 that food seemed to be a big part of how teaching is happening in school, especially the hands-on teaching. You could actually see how the thickness and the connection, heritage and food. Heritage is, food is part of heritage, and the children talked, and it's part of their culture. They talked about that a lot, and you can see that they use it in the school system as a process of learning, and you can you see the connection right there, and it's quite fascinating. And then another process of learning is the language that we talked about is connected right here. They connect again, and then they connect in the formal system. So you can see how these things are connecting from each other, from one group to the other, and what cultural elements are being used where. So you look at things like values is really, really thin. Like there's not a lot, the frequency is not as high as using food. Beliefs is a process, but it's not used significantly in school. There is a connect here in the tribe, but there's no big connect like from beliefs right to the education system. So that's what I'll say about that for now. If there's questions, I'll go back and try to give it my best shot. Students and cultural experts continue. It's, basically what we've seen is saying that there's weak or no interconnections except for the food that is used in education. Like the strongest connection is the food, but language is also part of it. And we'll see a couple more later, right here actually. So when we talk when I broke the students out and looked only at the students and not the students and the teachers, just the students, language, you can see language to heritage. Language connects to a heritage in the former education system, and also oral traditions. I can find it somewhere. Oral traditions was another one that had a connection that were being used in school a lot in the former system. It's clearer here, needed a bit bigger. That way it can be more evident, the CD evidence. But the thickness, the frequency is not enough. And these then locus stem are really like the catapult that we talked about, how sometimes they take things from outside to use in the classroom for better understanding. Now, run through some conclusions. So my research confirmed that there is a misalignment between the counting in the school and at home. There was definitely misalignment. I asked them if that affected how they learn. To them, it didn't even occur to them. So that was a nice shift, that even though they count the 1, 2, 3, and then they go 1 plus 1, 5 plus 1, 5 plus 2, 5 plus 3, compared to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it didn't affect them that they count one way at home and they count one way in school. So this group of students did not think it was a problem at all. It will be interesting to run a bigger research and see what others say. So he validated the mismatch between what and how children learn in school and at home, especially when they talked about circumcision and talked about the rite of passage. That one was, it really validated that the way that the children learn at home is different. Everything is hands-on. They learn from grandparents more than even from their parents. They watch what their elders are doing and then they mimic, or they go learn a trade from somebody in the community that knows how to do something. So learning is a life, is something that starts from childhood and is incorporated in their whole life style. So learning is not a classroom situation where you go sit down and you learn, unless you're an apprentice and then you go with that, you stay with one person and you're learning and living with that person. But overall, learning is just ingrained in part of the stages of life that they go through, like when you're born, when you get into adulthood, and when you get married, and then when you die. So it's a birth, the circumcision to prepare you for marriage, and then you die, and the rite of passage of that also. So it is, I don't know if I'm communicating it well, but as an African, for me, seeing somebody that was born and raised in a village, seeing that education is mainly in the classroom now, it's a mismatch for me, because it's like, well, these children are learning everything that is different. And then the research also showed from literature review that colonization was not, education was for the colonist. It wasn't necessarily for the people. It was to serve the need of the colonist. So if we keep educating our children in that light, then we are not necessarily educating our children to be productive members of our society. We're still following a mindset that was systematically put in place to serve a different purpose. And we've already talked about learning is community-based and project-based, hands-on. Processes, we confirmed that processes and strategies, practices of learning, they favor theory over practice, and they need to reveal the 9 elements that we've already seen. And again, to say the circumcision is a critical part of the culture of the Kisii people. Again, in my chapter 5, I had to clarify that I'm not advocating for girls to be circumcised or for boys to be circumcised in an unhealthy manner. Now there's hospitals, people go to the hospitals, but the tradition, the culture that was all part of that process is dying out because we're only focusing on the act of circumcision and not the why of circumcision. So it's important that that is revisited by the school system in Kenya or in Kisii. So the main things that really stood out that they use in school to better learning is language, heritage, oral tradition, and local STEM, like we've seen before. The beliefs, the values are not quite pushed the way or incorporated or integrated as much as participants would have loved to see. One thing that the teacher said that really stood out to me is that they come out the way they came in. So the teacher was basically saying that some of these children go to school, and because of that mismatch that I mentioned in the very beginning, that their neural pathway is formed towards learning at the community level and working the community with the language, with serving the community. But when they go to school, it's a whole different system. They learn things that are not usually relevant to that culture. So it seems like they're learning all over again. So sometimes you blame the child for not being smart enough or not being good enough at a subject, but it's not usually the case. So poor education outcome is, in my opinion, after this research, it's a system failure, not the learner's lack of mental capacity to perform well in school. And again, going back to the system, the local context and the culture, what is prioritized in the school to help the child connect the outside and the classroom. So these are the 9 cultural elements that I believe if the school systems can go back, and initiation is another word of saying rite of passage. So if you see initiation is just a big umbrella name also that I use for rite of passage. So these 9 elements, I believe, are necessary from this research to be a part of the education system in Kisii. If we want cultural, if the tribe wants cultural relevant education, it is important to look at each of these elements and see how these elements fit in the life of the people there and how to make the education system more balanced, more relatable, in a way that the child doesn't feel like they are leaving themselves home every time they go into the classroom. Now it seems like they have a fractured identity, the identity for the classroom, the identity for school, for home. So if these things are incorporated, I'm hoping that it will make a difference. It has not been tested, so I cannot say 100% it will make a difference and maybe improve learning, but I could only suggest that it be tested. So rite of passage should be taught in school with equal weight as circumcision. So that's a misstatement. Circumcision of the girls. So what the teachers wanted to see or the participants wanted to see beside the children was, because the children didn't really talk a lot about it, was that they teach in the Kisii schools or in the Kenyan education system, they teach a lot about male circumcision, but female circumcision is a taboo. So they would like for it to be taught on equal weight. And a way to safely do that is by looking at the why of circumcision in general and not just what is being done or the practice itself or the cutting of the skin. And then since circumcision is such a part of the identity of the tribe, during this period, they would like for the government, the administrators at the schools where they are in Kisii to provide more time for them. They complain that with COVID, the December period that they used to have for circumcision, they don't have anymore. And if they want that time back, they want to have that time. That way, people are not sneaking into the hospitals and doing circumcision, coming back without doing the process of circumcision and teaching their children the values that they need to know. And giving them the time also shows respect for the tribe. It shows respect for the people's beliefs and values. So I am supporting that recommendation that this needs to be done in a safe manner, but at the same time, respect needs to be given to the tribe for what they believe. And if anything like circumcision or any other big cultural value that will impact the identity of the people is going to be removed, a large majority of the population needs to be consulted. A couple of the people that I talked to were almost at the point of tears or heartbreak. You could see their heartbreak from the fact that circumcision was banned, but nobody explained to them why it was banned. And to them, their culture is being killed when things are done in a way that does not respect the culture. They just ban things and not tell them why so that they can reason together and figure out a best strategy for moving forward. That to them is killing their culture. So that was really some emotional talk right there, which I thought would be important to share with you. So another group wanted that the local languages in those schools that do not teach the local language anymore, that the local language be reinstated in those schools. And the challenge is for teaching in the local language from, the goal is primary 1 through 3. They were supposed to teach children in their local language before switching to English. So the complaint is that teachers don't want to do it because it's not graded. So maybe if the government of the education system in Kisii can institute grading of the tribal language, and then it will force the teachers to be able to teach it. There are other complexities around it, but that is the recommendation, and that is some of the key things that came out from the research. My first thing is in countries or tribes that have colonial background.
Yeah,
it is important to repeat this research that I just did. Maybe more money. I did it as a student, but repeat this. A country should repeat this research in a way that it pulls out. Maybe it will be broad. If they do it by tribe, it will be even better. Like go by tribe and see what are the cultural elements in that tribe that are most important to those people in that tribe. What is important to those people in that tribe? Once you know those things, then you can use those things now. Like in the case of Kisii, we know what their cultural, the things that they value are already. Now we take those things that they value, you expand upon them. You really it's like writing a book out about rites of passage, values as far as the Kisii people are concerned. And then you see how you can integrate it into the education system. So you take these things, you integrate them into the education system, whether it's a curriculum, the pedagogy, materials, whatever it is, you look at those two things to if you have to take out something that is highly Eurocentric, but not improving the child's learning, you take it out and then you put in what will improve the learning. That's why in this model, we use the word augmentation, because we want to improve on the colonial system that is in place. Education is a beautiful thing. We will not be sitting here having this discussion if I had not gone to school. So education is good, but it is now a matter for us to figure out what is important to the tribe, what is important to that context of the child, and then look at all the materials that we are using, or how our leaders leading. Is there a certain way that the community leadership is leading? If you want to even go to the perspective of leadership, is there a way that they do it that is effective to that tribe? How do we incorporate that into the school system and into the classroom, just to help with the cognition and the identity? What is it that will make them have better an identity that is not fragmented because of the colonial ways of looking at things, or the Eurocentric worldviews that might conflict with the tribal worldviews? So that's the one step I would say it's absolutely necessary to look at these cultural elements and bring them into whatever we do. And then when it comes to global learning, now we know like STEM is something that is we see it crosses cultures easily. That's something that crosses culture easily. I suggest that in looking at STEM, we have to always reflect carefully. What are we adopting? What are we adopting from? With modern days, there's a lot of things. You go online, you can find a lot of things. But what are you adopting? Is it relevant to this culture? So you take what is considered global learning and you look at it from your context. How can I make this apply to me without diluting the key principle in that idea? I think I'm giving a presentation on culture, on a Kisii culture, but I'm giving in a way that anybody can understand it. So you contextualize it, you try to reflect, think ahead, analyze the situation, look at other ways that you can present that particular thing so that it crosses cultures. And then at that point, we come in as colonized indigents, we come in with a balance of two cultures where we know really well what our culture is and how we fit in the global world. And then if we are going to transfer something to the global world, we also know what's happening in the global world and how do our own culture fit in that. Like if I'm teaching STEM, when I say catapult, I show you a picture because that's what I'm saying. You want to be able to visualize it and conceptualize it and look at it. Is it even relevant in the US culture to do anything with catapult? Maybe not, unless you live, I don't know where. Like you probably have to go somewhere where you have to shoot birds and things to use a catapult. It's not a common concept in the US. So for me to talk about catapult, I have to show a picture, then I have to talk about centripetal force, then I have to talk about other examples that present centripetal force in a way that somebody else understands. Without all of that, putting it in context and culture of the person adopting and the person transferring, when you look at both ends before you deliver, then it helps you to maintain that global learning without losing yourself. I think I'm giving a presentation on culture, on a Kisii culture, but I'm giving in a way that anybody can understand it. So you contextualize it,